So in this lesson we're going to go over the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, and what you're looking at here is a drawing of a mid-sagittal section through the CNS, and basically what that means is that this is as if we've cut the brainstem and spinal cord in half and removed one half of it, and in this case we've removed the left half of the nervous system. And what you're looking at is everything on the right side from the midline. So this would be the medial surface of the right cerebral hemisphere, and you can see that the cerebellum's been cut in half, as has the brainstem and the cervical spinal cord. And some of the structures you see here are the superior sagittal sinus, which is lined by the periosteal and the meningeal layers of the dura. And then below that you have the arachnoid membrane. And then the pia would be the membrane right next to the cerebral hemisphere, but you can't really see it here. So CSF is produced here in this structure, which is the lateral ventricle, and in this structure, which is the third ventricle. It's also produced down here in the fourth ventricle. So those are the ventricles of the brain. So the ventricular system is inside the brain, and it is composed of the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, this little space here, which is the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. So CSF basically is made by this structure, which is called the choroid plexus. It lines the floor of the lateral ventricle and the roof of the third ventricle and the roof of the fourth ventricle. And it's made of specialized cells which are fed by special blood vessels, and the CSF is then produced, and then it exits the ventricles into these subarachnoid spaces. And the function of the CSF, or one of its functions, is to provide buoyancy for the brain. So basically the brain and the brainstem are floating in the CSF, which basically reduces their effective weight and provides kind of a cushion. So that's why the CSF has to escape into this space, so that the brain can float in that space, or in the CSF. So the way it does that, the way the CSF exits the ventricular system and gets into the subarachnoid space, is through these foramina. The midline foramen, there's one in the midline that's called foramen of Magendie, and there's two lateral foramina of Luschka. Here we only see the right foramen of Luschka because we've removed the left half of the brain and we don't see that foramen. So easy way to remember that is Magendie starts with an M, so it's midline. Luschka starts with an L, and that's lateral. So the CSF, once it enters the subarachnoid space, then has to get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So CSF, remember, starts from the blood vessels, and then eventually, to complete the loop, it has to re-enter the vascular system. And it does that through these special outpouchings of the arachnoid membrane known as the arachnoid granulations. So CSF goes back and is reabsorbed into the dural venous sinus here, which then eventually goes back to the heart through the internal jugular veins, etc. Some other structures you can see here are, as I said, this is the third ventricle. So the third ventricle and the lateral ventricles are connected by this foramen here, which is the interventricular foramen of Monroe. That's a bilateral structure, and you're only seeing the right one. The left one has been removed. This here is the midbrain, and the subarachnoid space that surrounds the midbrain is known as the perimesencephalic cistern. And that can be subdivided further into the interpeduncular cistern here, and the quadrigeminal cistern up here. This here in front of the pons is the pre-pontine cistern, and in the cistern back here is the cisterna magna. And all of these cisterns are in communication with each other. So basically that summarizes the flow of CSF from inside the brain in the ventricular system through the foramina of Magendie and Lischka into the subarachnoid spaces, and then finally back through the arachnoid granulations into the superior sagittal sinus, and then back into the bloodstream.